So we are recording now. So I'll just ask everyone, if you're not presenting, to have your microphone muted. My name is Chris Price. I'm the Academic Programs Manager for the SUNY Center for Professional Development. And so welcome everybody to this webinar, giving a summary of some of the IITG Innovative Instruction Technology Grant projects from 1920. I think I tried to group them all in a common theme, although some of them were just, this is the time that folks can make. But today I'm excited since my background is faculty development, professional development, and a lot of the projects today have a significant faculty development component. So I'm really excited about that. Typically we would have everybody present at the Conference on Instruction and Technology, which was supposed to take place back in May in Oswego, and obviously that was canceled this year, and we didn't something online, but it was nothing like CIT typically is. So I asked all the folks who received grants if they'd be willing to come and just give an overview of what they accomplished in the last year, and some advice for anybody that wants to kind of take what they did and run with it. And so I thank them all again today, and we have an order going on, and I'm just going to turn off my mic and camera in a second and turn it over to them, because like I said, we only have 15 minutes per presentation. And I believe, Gary, you're up first, and Ed, and I'll just let you introduce yourselves and share your screen if you'd like to. So take it away.
I guess the best place to start is at the beginning with a thought. Basically, I have just a quick intro slide, and I will, in the interest of brevity, basically, I'm from Old Westbury. Without Ed's help and insight and extensive experience, this wouldn't have happened. And actually, not from the basic kernel of the beginning, but I was teaching a marketing course for many years, but ultimately I was looking for ways for students to get more out of the experience. It was a hybrid delivery, but a traditional delivery nonetheless. So I started looking for things that I thought could enhance that experience, and it led me to the ultimate bottom line is, how do you teach a student in class and have the application? Well, the best way is through applied learning, and then in this case now, moving forward a little more quickly, is having that applied learning in the classroom with a parallel or a standard delivery is how I say it, but basically finding a appropriate simulation, in this case a marketing simulation, that can be utilized and delivered with the PowerPoints, the assessments, and all the standard, you would say, support for a course, but also offer that component, which would be the obvious, what we're speaking of is that simulation or a game, trying to inject a little bit of fun and also learning through the, in this case, the applied learning. But the one thing I want to say without spending too much time, and I'm trying to speed along, but basically the main idea, not for the grant, I'll get to that in a moment, but ultimately offering the class a parallel experience wherein that, I could get across, the chapter material, the PowerPoints, the assessment, the any sort of material, and I sometimes use cases, is where I was having a slipped gear for a moment there, sorry. But basically the idea of having all of this occur and then introduce students to something that was new, or at least for us within the School of Professional Studies at Old Westbury. The students themselves embraced the challenge, if you will, and also I took the other opportunity to place them in groups for the simulation decisions, and ultimately maybe have them work on their soft skills as well. So if I go back to the idea of applied learning, having the classroom experience and having a simulation delivered as a parallel experience, I thought, what could be better? And essentially, I started to look for the simulations that I thought would do what I was seeking. And I think, again, in the interest of time, the main concerns I had with the simulation, or the company to provide such a simulation, is the setup, and I've learned through experience from years back, support. Anytime you're doing something online, it's a great idea to have outside support. I don't want to be teacher as well as the support desk, which kind of detracts from the whole experience. But the main thing is that the simulation itself, and that was just the beginning, lent itself through conversation with Ed Bever and basically myself. And I had no idea of the background Ed had in the simulations and games and things of such. And we took it to the next step, which was obviously the ITG grant. I created a training. It was a 6-week course for a new faculty member, or should I say a seasoned faculty member who's never touched a simulation before. So the idea was to come up with a way of extending this to the department, faculty, those who might want to, but delivered a 6-week training with another faculty member, which ultimately comes down to, and let me just share another screen, basically, and I will make it available. Let's do this. Sorry, let's do another screen. And hey, I don't see it. Let me see if I can bring it up and I won't waste your time. But basically, I have it available and I will be sharing it. Basically, the 6-week training, as it is, basically had week 1 is in any other course preparation prior to meeting. That time was spent enlightening the faculty member and trying to bring them into what a simulation or a game could be, or how it could enhance the classroom experience. The term the game, obviously, with children and others, you know, the focus is stronger, the idea of fun, and also what I thought was an outcome was in this case, the applied learning aspect of the material and discipline of marketing. But ultimately, week 1 was more of a prep week for the professor leading up to that first meeting. And then we went into the idea of the simulation itself. There are many, many simulations, many disciplines. Could be any number. It could be history, political science, finance, and any discipline. It's really as limited as being able to find, I would consider, an appropriate simulation that's professionally developed and supported. I can't say supported enough, but essentially having all those bits and pieces together will help a faculty member deliver what I would consider a successful simulation and ultimately the class. So week 1 is the preparation, readings, and getting that person up to speed on what a simulation is or how that's going to impact the class, integrating the number of weeks you're dealing with, ultimately having the simulation, as I said, a parallel delivery, dovetail with the lessons and the decisions within the game itself. So basically, while you're going through chapters 1 and 2 and 3, but basically they need to align with the simulation and the decisions for that game or for the team. And I did put them in teams. So week 1 is preparation, choosing the simulation as I quickly went into, and basically, let me just try one last time to bring that up for you, because it's better than just a talking head. No.
Is it a link?
It's not actually.
Okay.
It was just a, you know, and I prepared in advance, and of course this is not a technical failure, it's mine, but you know, sorry folks, but I'm not seeing it where I put it, but maybe it closed. My apologies. But ultimately it'll be available afterwards, and I have the document, and I'll upload it and have it available. So anyway, week 1, 2, 3 is set up. So basically, what I ended up doing with the faculty member is ran through the actual game itself, a live simulation. So basically, the faculty member was able to play the game, the student-facing interface or student-facing decisions, what the lessons are, all provided by the simulation company, right down to the readings, the text, everything, self-contained. And then also the back end, the dashboards involved with grading and really the core of what there was. So the faculty member was exposed through use prior to actually even playing the full game. The integration is week 4 for a syllabus. The integration itself I felt was important because of the alignment with the decisions themselves, or actual the outcome for the game was based on a number of decisions. Depending upon the actual simulation or the game, there is a number of decision sets, and the students needed to prepare for those decisions. So through the class delivery or the lecture, and as well as the material that's provided through the simulation itself, I felt the students had more than enough prep time and really a grounding in those areas that we focused upon to make a decision in the game. And also, obviously, I had additional assessments set up. Yeah?
Oh, just it's 10 minutes in, so
Sorry.
a little bit of time for Question.
Any questions? I'm getting the hook. So anyway, week 5 and then week 6. That's all right. But basically, the simulation, the training, and ultimately delivered. So I don't know if I'll say anybody have any questions, but I will be making the training obviously available, and I apologize for not having on the screen.
Yeah, no problem, Gary. I mean, yeah, we have time. I mean, I know we start a little late, so you've got about to about 12:16. I was 17 there, so
No, you saved me
you
with
to
the
go into
rambling.
anything else. That's good.
No, no, that's all right. No, well, basically, all I was really going to go to is I won't say how overwhelming success it was, but essentially, it did work out well. I delivered one simulation back in 2019, the first one, and then that led to the whole idea of actually having other faculty offer this. So really, through the training or the scalability of this, and I had in mind teaching one faculty member or multiple. So basically, this could be offered or rolled out by truly almost anyone if they just really have a little bit of, I don't want to say creativity or imagination, but the students enjoyed it. I'd say for the most part, we're talking about a number of classes. The students enjoyed themselves. But I will say that I didn't place a high emphasis on winning the game. What I was placing my emphasis upon is actually the decisions themselves and learning from the game. The emphasis can be changed by the faculty member as their personality will come into play, obviously, for the course. The classroom delivery are virtual these days. But ultimately what could happen for the class is, basically the instructor's personality will come through in either the simulation or the classroom activities. And the last thing I'll just get to is what I thought was very important along with applied learning was actually the soft skill development. A lot of the students, we all know that there is somebody, if you place students in team environments, there's going to be one lead and then someone's going to follow up the rear and perhaps maybe just sit around waiting for everybody else to do the work. But in this instance, I could say that we had more individuals participating because of I think the newness to the students. But ultimately, what it'll come back to is what I would consider my main points was basically offering a fun experience for the students in the simulation itself, being able to have them apply what they're already learning in the classroom, and then ultimately come away from the class with maybe a higher level of development soft skills. And I'm talking about a marketing class, which lends itself to a corporate or a different environment. So they end up getting what I would consider a multiple benefit, whether they realized it or not. But ultimately, what it would come down to for all, going back to the grant momentarily, is that the training itself is scalable, does work well. The only modification I did is what I had shared, really without saying it, but basically when I originally had done the training, it did not include really a run through of the simulation for the new faculty or the new instructor, which it made sense actually. So that was the main modification. But other than that, I think it was a success in the training work, the simulation work. I look forward to maybe doing something else in the future, or maybe scaling it to a couple of other faculty members. But again, I think Chris, you mentioned that the ITG grant for the moment is basically on hold.
Yeah, well, we still getting a little feedback there. So yeah, we definitely are interested in what and having a training curriculum for faculty, though, definitely. But any questions? Does anybody have any questions for Gary or Ed? I mean, you can put it in the chat, or you could just open your mic. It's a small enough group.
Well, you're thinking, I'll just add a couple of quick things. One, the success of the training is indicated by how smoothly the transition to totally online remote went in the middle of COVID. I mean, that was an unanticipated thing, but in both classes, particularly in the trainees class, it went fine. And the other is there's been some turnover in the teaching of the class that the trainee did. And actually Maureen Keefe, who you can see if you're looking at the gallery view, is going to be using the training with Gary again this fall to prepare to use it in the spring. So we definitely want to keep this going. But
yeah, I mean, there's been a, go ahead, yeah.
I was planning on using it in the finance, and we had looked at a couple of the games that they had for that. And I was really very excited about using it, but given the pandemic, it'll take a little bit longer for me to get that integrated into my coursework.
Well, one of the things I really like about your project is that, typically you have lone wolf faculty kind of doing these things on their own. And the fact that you kind of brought a group of faculty together and created a training program for them to learn how to use it and to do this, do simulations, I think is to me the right approach for this type of technology. So good to hear. Any questions? Like another minute or so. No questions. Well, if you do think of a question, certainly put in the chat, and I'm sure Gary would be happy to answer it there. But thank you both, and let's move on next
Thank you.
to
Thank you, guys.
Jacob at Cortland.
Hello, everyone. Let me get my presentation up, and also want to share a link. We created a transcript for our presentation, so if you'd like to be able to see what we're saying, then you can click on the link there to our Google Doc.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been toying with live transcriptions, and the only reason we're not using them now is because when we record to the cloud and upload to YouTube, we upload the transcription into YouTube. So,
Yeah,
but thank you for doing that. That's actually good practice. I should be doing that.
No problem. We felt inclined to do so since our presentation is on universal design for instruction. So anyway, so let me share our screen and we can begin. Okay. Justin, are you on the line here too?
Yep, I'm on.
Okay, great. So welcome to our presentation on universal course design, broadening access to meaningful learning, and hearing what we did in our IITG grant. My name is Jake Hall, and I'm an assistant professor at SUNY Cortland, and I'll let my co-PI introduce himself.
And I'm Justin Friedman. I'm an assistant professor of special and inclusive education at Rowan University, which is in New Jersey. Jake and I did get a picture together on graduation day. We finished our PhDs in 2018 at Syracuse University, but we could not find the picture of us together somehow. So here's two photos next to each other of us separately with different people, but it looks pretty close to the real thing.
And not on the transcript, but I do want to add that we work together with other faculty as well. Carrie Rude and Maria Timberlake are professors at SUNY Cortland, and they were also collaborators on this grant.
So the boxes on the outside of the graphic are just a few of the ways that students in higher education differ in terms of their characteristics and identities. So rather than teaching with the quote unquote traditional college student in mind, folks in higher education are increasingly recognizing the need for instruction that's designed to anticipate a range of characteristics. So the question that we began with was, how can faculty actually design instruction to plan for the diverse ways that students engage in learning, and then to address barriers that they may face? So our project began with considering something that we found to be an apparent tension, and that is inclusive pedagogies such as universal design frameworks. And we have a couple universal design frameworks listed there on the slide. They have broad principles and approaches to implementing flexible and accessible instruction that anticipates diverse learners. Yet often they don't have an efficient process for designing from sort of A to Z. And so on the other hand, frameworks within instructional design do provide more of that efficient and kind of robust design process, though without considering how instruction will respond to diverse characteristics and needs of students. So rather than a sort of either or a tug of war, which the image kind of suggests there on the screen, we wanted to try to create some synergy between the inclusive pedagogy aspects of universal design, and then a framework within the field of instructional design.
So our project began following Lian Zhang's approach to model development, and it's a two-pronged approach that we followed. In the first one is indicated by the top line of theory-driven approach, which searches through literature and hopes of then synthesizing an ADDIE or analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation framework. And then the bottom line is a more of a practice-driven approach that you merge at the end. So we began our literature review by using Andrews and Goodson's 16 common tasks for model development. And in that, we analyzed 13 instructional design models and 9 universal design models. And we really were looking for patterns between the two and which of these, ADDIE elements were these models emphasizing and which were they focusing on to varying degrees. Once we had identified some of those key elements, we moved on to our practice-driven approach, and we planned a universal design for learning retreat that was implemented in January with the Cortland School of Education faculty. And our focus at this retreat was really on the front end, the analysis, design, and development portions of an instructional design process. And Tobin and Bailing's work on instructional or universal design in higher ed was really foundational to the workshops that we offered at this retreat. We had around 25 School of Education faculty from Cortland join us at the retreat in January. And it was really three big outcomes that we were hoping to achieve as indicated by this image. We really wanted it to be a reciprocal opportunity for us to learn from them and their experiences in applying universal design. Again, going back to our practice-driven approach of hearing lessons from implementation. And we wanted to introduce, sorry. We wanted to introduce our initial model and what we had found in the literature and begin seeking feedback and possible critique. And we also then wanted to use the retreat to support faculty in immediate changes or revisions to the courses.
And another important aspect as we were planning the retreat was to model UDL throughout. So we provided flexible, what we call paths throughout the retreat. So we encourage faculty to select which workshops would best fit their needs for being able to make immediate changes to their courses. We also used live captioning for our presentation, and we provided materials in multiple formats so folks could use the degree of technology that they wanted. We also encourage faculty to choose how and when to apply their learning in hopes that they would immediately apply things to their courses. And a couple key concepts, we encourage faculty to bring materials actually there so that they were able to work on their syllabi, for example, to work on their course policies. And we also introduced them to a couple of process-oriented aspects of universal design. So in the middle of the screen there is the idea of pinch points. And then we'll talk about that more in a moment. And then that's basically target areas of a course. And then the second idea on the right-hand side is a +1 approach. And that's focusing in on redesigning one aspect of instruction based on a target area.
So here's an example of 3 of the paths we provided to faculty in the very first session of the retreat. We had 5 total paths, and essentially we were sharing the agenda and what would be available throughout the retreat and trying to help, again, a UDL strategy being putting this idea of learners identifying a goal in the learning. And so we, at the end of this path, provided a couple possible goals that one might have for the retreat, and then planned out potential pathways to achieve those goals. One I want to point out is the 4th boxes, starting from the left going to right, scaffolded design and independent work. One of our workshops was actually a space set up for Maria and Carrie, who have a lot of experience implementing UDL and actually working one-on-one with faculty or small groups. Justin mentioned pinch points was one of the guiding thinking in our workshops. And so similar to the idea of a pinch point, occurring where gears might meet. We asked where in our courses might our learners be getting stuck, where are learners having frequent questions, where do we see little to no participation, maybe even by specific subsets of students, and where are we seeing quote unquote low performance in our courses, and this could be those areas of pinch point.
And then another workshop that we did was on engaging students with course goals, and we focused particularly on communicating goals to students. One method to highlight is the interactive or live syllabus, as it's been called, asking faculty to use that, to consider using that for communicating goals with students, but then also on the back end, using assessment and feedback to reconnect and have consistent connection to course goals throughout the course. And then in terms of one other aspect of applying the analysis of learners, so just to give some examples of that +1 approach here, this is from the end of a presentation, a workshop that was looking at how to universally design for disability accommodations. And then in the center there, how to design for mobile learners. And so it's an example of where we had some options for immediately on the left-hand side, revise a policy to universally design accommodation, or look at one specific practice to target mobile learners. And then on option 3 on the right-hand side is to plan to analyze for the long term. And then there's resources at the bottom. So it's that choice of short and long term changes to the course.
And of course, we had a workshop on media selection and development as well. And the idea here, the picture of the donut is meant to illustrate the need for providing meaningful choice for experiencing interactions and not just simply providing a bunch of variety for our learners to cycle kind of pointlessly through. And then the other picture of the VR headset is this idea that our selection and development of technology doesn't need to be super complex or high end. In fact, for those of us who, like me as a professor of ed tech, I might be considered a techie. I sometimes need to be reminded to tone it down and add some actual text elements to my course as multiple means of interaction. Feedback was really positive. We had a lot of appreciation for the potential to work with other faculty in this way, to talk about ways to engage learners in multiple ways, and really a lot of positive feedback on the opportunity to actually work on something and complete something by the end of the day. And in our survey, every single attendee but one mentioned actually achieving some sort of revision on their course or syllabus. Our next steps, we had a focus group planned with retreat attendees to actually talk with them more about how they implemented some of these workshop steps in their design. But as many things, right, it got canceled, and we hopefully will be able to do that in the future. We've also been working with the Institute for College Teaching on the Cortland campus to possibly, once funding streams get back up, create some sort of grant opportunity to have faculty recruit them to make a design revision in their course based on some of this model framework, and then do a little action research with that to try to actually develop the practice-driven part of our model and finalize it. And here, all of our workshop materials are available through this bit.ly or that QR code. And we'd be happy to talk with you about how you could use it on your campus.
Very cool. If one of you guys could drop that bit.ly off of your slide deck into the chat, that would be awesome.
Great idea.
And not everybody has the, maybe their phone so they can get that, but that's great. Any questions? We have a couple minutes left. Questions?
Are you tied in with the EIT initiative on your campus? I don't know if you're aware of it, but the system is mandated that all electronic systems have to become accessible, and I'm involved with it on our campus. This looks very interesting because it's a big problem. Are you engaged with them?
No, that's a new acronym to me. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, if you talk to your person who's in disability services on your campus, they'll know all about it.
This would be a big help to them and to everybody across the system, because that's the huge problem. Is it's an enormous task, and it's like everybody's looking at everything at once, and you've kind of broken it down to, step by step and moving it forward in a manageable way. And that's something everybody's looking for.
Yeah, that was a conversation that came up at the retreat actually, and was right. Like the Universal Design for Learning framework can help us design our courses in which certain accommodations are no longer something we have to plan for after the fact, like we're already providing them up front. However, there will still be some need for accommodations for certain students' specific needs. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, I'm super impressed by what you put together. Knowing, having worked on a campus and tried to help faculty with universal design. I mean, I really like that you applied universal design principles to the faculty development program and that you provided those multiple paths. I think that we often forget that faculty are like any other learners, right? They're starting from different places. They have different skill sets. You can't just give them a one size fits all approach. And so I think what you guys did is fantastic. Thank
Thanks,
you very
Chris.
much. Yeah.
All right.
All right, if you have any questions for them, the guys, just put them in the chat, and I'm sure if you're sticking around, they can answer them there. All right, so.
Yeah, if you could pass the questions on to me, Chris, I have to
You
run
have to run?
this
Sure.
class. So,
Sure.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Nice to meet all of you.
Thanks, Jake.
Yeah.
All right. So next up, we have Chris.
Hello.
Rates from eBay. Hey, Chris.
Okay, I'll assume you can hear me.
Yep, hear you fine.
Okay, and is the screen sharing working?
Looks good.
Okay. So my name is Chris Rates. I'm from the Center for Educational Innovation. We do faculty development at the University of Buffalo. And similar to the problem that Jacob was talking about, there's so many choices for what faculty can do and so many resources out there. One of our main issues has been trying to figure out how do you guide faculty to make improvements, especially when you have a very small group of people and a very large audience who needs this sort of help. So as I just mentioned, we do faculty development. Obvious reason for faculty development is to improve student outcomes. And about 3 years ago, I should say before 3 years ago, we basically did workshops that a lot of people didn't really attend. We'd put out some materials, and we had really no idea how anything was working. So we decided to focus on research-based methods for what faculty should implement in their courses. We worked with an initial 11 faculty doing one-to-one support. So we had individual meetings with them to look at their courses, figure out how to improve them. And then big group workshops where they kind of work together to make improvements and listen to each other. And from that, we also collected data. We looked at teaching observations, so active learning in their courses, student outcomes like DFRW rates, and then also what did it cost, kind of to improve their course. So this was kind of a more systematic way of trying to figure out how can we actually make an impact in courses. And from this, we found that faculty needed a lot more content than we were prepared to deliver, as well as better guidance, or really needed that one-on-one guidance. They also wanted specific content. So while we're teaching something abstract like active learning, they want to know, how do I apply this to what I'm teaching? The approach we also found was time consuming. So it was weekly meetings, one person to one person, and there's 12 of us at CEI, and there's probably around 2,000 faculty at the University of Buffalo. So that doesn't work. So there's an access issue. And then data. So actually deciding what matters when you change a course, how might you measure that? And when we were giving the reports back to faculty, they would look at it and it would say, you had questions for 20% of the time. And they would ask, is that good? Is that bad? What do I do with this information? And we didn't really know what to tell them. And then the third one, when we looked at student outcomes, there's just a lot of noise. There weren't a lot of patterns. So we were more systematic, and we were kind of left with some of these problems. And how do we make this work? So from that, we developed the Academies. So we have 3 different strands of 4 2-hour workshops. The first one being around backwards design, the second one being about how students learn and how you can better teach to students. And then the third one is about implementing that design. So that covered a much larger amount of the research literature. both based off of what we learned from having implemented it, but also spending about a year and a half actually looking at all of the literature and trying to figure out what's the most important stuff to include. And then using backwards design ourselves and figuring out what are the learning outcomes we want for faculty. So we went from one-to-one support to now trying to do one-to-many support. So that was through workshops, which are still somewhat limited, having an online course where we recorded the videos to walk them through the process in a MOOC, and then trying to also have the same sort of guidance on the website with materials and resources and kind of walking them through it. So the way to make these more effective was direct applications. So when they come in, everything is focused on how do you apply what you're learning, and anything that's not being applied is removed from the course, and then also guiding them as they make those changes. So these were the improvements that we made. So evidence-based direct application, and then the part I'm leaving out here, which is the data collection and how do we actually measure if these courses are improved or find any way to determine whether these improvements were doing what we hoped they would do, which is going to be the focus here of our ITG grant. So the problem is that the student outcomes and the faculty development are actually much further apart from each other. In between those, you have faculty motivation. So when they come and they learn about how to improve a course, do they actually believe it's worth doing? And then do they actually make a few changes or a bunch of changes? And at any point along the way, if faculty are not motivated, that's going to reduce outcomes. If they don't actually make applications, that's also going to reduce outcomes. So when we initially started trying to measure student outcomes, we didn't measure really anything in between, hence some of the measurement issues. So our current focus is looking at the EVC motivation theory, and I won't go into this too much because the focus of this is going to be in the second one here, is actually trying to figure out how do we know what designs need to be changed or how to know if somebody's actually improved something in their course, and then the same for teaching. So observing them teaching, especially now that faculty are mainly all teaching online or teaching a hybrid version or in person. And then I won't talk about the student outcomes because that's not really the focus here. It's going to be this after they leave our academies and we hope they go make changes, what's happening and how do we measure that? So it's a cycle, this continuous improvement, collect data and then improve what we're doing. The data that are the ways of collecting the data that we're looking at are surveys, interviews, trying to create some sort of design rubric to sort of measure what we care about, and then also teaching observations for the implementation. And depending on that sort of information, how do we improve the resources that we offer or the way that we walk faculty through course improvement, as well as how they might improve their teaching. So those two areas there. So the goals for our grant were finding out, do faculty maintain interest and actually make changes when they leave? And if they don't, why not, or what can we do to help? What needs do they have or barriers when they're trying to make these changes on their own? And then depending on that, what sort of further supports can we create to help them? And then how do we know what changes have occurred? So both in, I don't remember what that one means. Just knowing either the process that they should go through to make the changes, and then some way of organizing or quantifying those changes. So for the first research question, did they maintain interest? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we gave this at the wrong time when COVID started. So we only had an N of 26. We also were unable to give a financial incentive to fill out these surveys that we had originally signed up for, so not a huge response. But from that, we found that 85% of people did make changes to their course. 100% of people said that they would continue to make those changes. So they had a good experience with them. And then over half of the participants plan on making future changes, so continuing to improve their course. So they had a good experience with that. And then asking, did they feel that they were well prepared? Majority of people felt they were well prepared. Most changes were around assessment and activities. Often after they kind of worked on their learning outcomes, those would follow with backwards design. And then the main area that they had when it came to barriers were something we called situational factors. So time to make the changes, trying to make changes with such a large class size, and then not having support from their department to actually make changes. So the future work that we're putting together for deliverables for this are resources to help kind of focus on that cost issue of time and how to do these more efficiently, or what sort of changes they can make that will save them time in the future. For the second area, we then looked at interviewing 11 alumni. These were 1-hour semi-structured interviews. We talked to them about what their original goals were for improving their courses, what their needs were, and the outcomes that they had experienced over the last year. The findings from that were almost everybody had no previous teaching support. They all kind of learned on their own or from other faculty members. They hadn't really had any training that they had gone through, unless maybe they had done some teaching as a grad student. They all did have difficulty with initial implementation, which could be expected, and then usually on the second try, things were a lot easier. But the main issue that they also had was a real difficulty in interpreting what's going on, what's actually working or not working, and if things aren't working, why aren't they working? So they made changes, but for them to re-implement and improve, they really don't quite know how to read what's happening. So they need help with that. So while we're still analyzing this, this was just a few months ago, there's this measurement issue, which is basically trying to figure out, so what did you change? And then how do we measure the effects of those changes, whether it's surveys of students or looking at grades or observations. So this brings us to the third issue, which is what we're working on this semester with 9 of the participants. We're looking at a course improvement process. So we sat down with each participant after kind of piloting and drafting a process. And we wanted to find out, how can we be more effective in guiding and giving feedback? And how can we increase their role in making the changes and reduce ours? Because our ultimate goal is to provide this sort of support without necessarily being there to do it for them. And then the measurement issue, which is, what do they need to know in order to make the changes? And then how do they know they've succeeded with them? So what we attempted to do was not just a data dump of here's all the information we have. And it was also not just let's start by telling you what we think you should change or what's wrong. We actually worked on starting with goal setting and having them tell us what they want to improve. And then sharing the specific information that we think will help them get there. And I'll talk about this just briefly in a little bit, but we're working with a psychologist and somebody who does motivational interviewing to actually find out, well, what's the best way to help somebody kind of improve and want to be the ones improving what they're doing, especially when we have faculty who have been sent to us and don't necessarily want to be improving their courses, nor do they think that their course is the issue. So starting with them making their choices, doing some sort of systematic review, and I'll mention in a second, but using the Oscar rubric and some supplements. Can't actually see what's here. Oh, then creating a plan that they're going to follow, letting them implement those changes, teach the changes, and then helping collect data and then reviewing what happened. So both between that systematic review and that collecting data, there's 2 measurement issues to help faculty make sense of what's happening. So I mentioned motivational interviewing is one area that we're going to be working on. And then this other area of breaking up design and teaching. So when somebody says, I did active learning, I don't know if it's working, or please tell me if active learning is happening. The first place to look is it actually built into your course? Because there's no point in saying you didn't do it well if it's not even built in. So actually trying to break these 2 things apart and see how they interact with each other. So currently we're using and have used the Oscar with all of the faculty, both them using the Oscar, us using the Oscar, and then comparing what we found with those, and then creating some sort of action plan. And we're looking to automate this in the future so that when they do fill out these designs, it's guiding them to actually tell them what sort of types of changes they should make. And to be fair, the Oscar people have put all of this together already. It's an amazing resource if you haven't looked at it, but trying to find a way to give them the information and guide them through just what they need as they need it, and combining that with teaching observations. So it's almost done here. So the systematic review of the AAU institutions to actually look at what do they use for measurement in college courses, and also looking at the literature. Two lessons from the previous process in that is needing to quantify and actually organize these course changes. So if somebody just added a single top hat question in the course, is that really the same as adding an active learning? And then breaking up the design and teaching, as I just mentioned. So there are several resources for these already, and we've started to align all of them and compare them. And this fall, about halfway through the semester, which is coming up very soon, we're going to start implementing these and then creating some supplements of our own. So deliverables, as I mentioned, for the barriers with the situational factors, creating resources to help them overcome those, and how they might use that in say, an online learning format. The process, so finalizing that with the motivational interviewing, and then testing that out with all future faculty that we have over this next semester, and what that guidance might look like and how we might automate that. We actually are lucky enough to have some programmers who are helping us with that right now. And then the third part is this data issue, and trying to look at both design and teaching observation, especially online, but probably the most important thing is finding a way to report this information so faculty can interpret it and actually do something with it instead of staring at us, or if we're not there, not having anybody to help them with it. So these are our current focus that we're hoping to finish up before the end of December.
Thanks, Chris. So, that's great. And there's actually a question in the chat, which I'll ask you to get to there because we're out of time. But I just want to say one thing before we transition to Michelle, and that is that I was super excited about this project when I saw it, because nobody in SUNY is doing this, and very few people are doing what you're doing, and centers for teaching and learning, only the really most probably well-resourced centers out there are doing this kind of work, where you basically develop a comprehensive faculty professional development program and then assess it to improve it in a continuous fashion. So kudos to you all. I'm excited to see where it's going. And like I said, Keith Landa has a question in the chat for you. So if you could address it there, I'd appreciate it. So we have plenty of time for Michelle. Thanks again.
Sure. Let me just pull up the chat here.
Michelle?
Oh yeah, we are using, we were using Oscar for the face-to-face classes, but we were just pulling out parts of that. So this is part of where the supplementing and the adding in is what we're trying to figure out how to do now, especially since everybody we worked with is doing a online class this semester, but when they originally signed up, it was an in-person class. So we're adapting as we go.
Thanks. So if anybody has any other questions for Chris, and you guys could just chat about them. And last but not least, Michelle, take it away.
All right, thanks everyone. Chris will have to talk, my team will have to talk with you. We're doing some similar things. So the name of our project was Creating Points of Transformation in SUNY STEM Education. I'm at Binghamton University. I think several of my colleagues are on this call now. Liza Riley is the Director of Sensor Science Education for New Civic Engagements and Responsibilities. Sue-Ann Yang at Geneseo and Peter Gergen both have a history with the Summer Institutes on Scientific Teaching, which is both of those are professional development programs that have been around for a while at the national level, working with faculty to transform their classrooms, similar to some of the things that Chris just talked about. And then David Parfit at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Geneseo was instrumental in helping us do this. So Chris hit on a lot of the things about professional development, why we would need this, but especially if you look in STEM, although our program is already moving beyond STEM, but if you look there, less than half of our students who come in and declare those majors persist. And if you look at why that is, we know what the problem is and we know what the answers are. So if you look at two big recent meta studies They've looked at the impact of active learning. These meta-studies have done analyses across, I don't know, hundreds of different studies using active learning in a variety of ways. And what they find the take-home messages are that it improves student performance, it decreases failure rates, and it reduces achievement gaps between majority underserved populations. So we know what to do, but there's a lag, as many of you know, in what the literature tells us to do and what faculty are doing in our classrooms. And so our project really was to bring together, join forces of two of these prominent professional development programs in the country that happen to have roots in the SUNY system, and try to focus the joint effort of those two groups on the SUNY system and leverage the connectivity that we have in the system to see if we can get diffusion of evidence-based teaching practices sort of further faster. So we have, page down. So we have this vision of STEM education that goes beyond maybe just getting students active in class and improving performance. The Willy Wonka pictures over here are meant to give you that sense of what it was like when the kids first entered the chocolate factory, and they have that sense of wonder and joy and potential for discovery. And we really think that college education should do that for students. So we want a STEM education, and as I said, sort of beyond STEM, that is inclusive, that is relevant, so students see how that relates to what they care about and contributes to what they want to become in the future. It nurtures whole person development instead of just thinking about, you're going through my class, you should learn this content, you should achieve this skill. I already said the fourth one, the instilling the sense of wonder and joy, and also supports the greater good. When we look at our society and the problems that we're facing, we need a STEM workforce that has had an experience like the one that I've just described to get them ready to face those challenges. These are the two programs that are joining forces. As I said, Eliza Riley is here. She's director of Sensor. Sensor's been around since 2001. You can see the mission and primary mechanisms here. Both of these use professional development workshops that are focused on inclusive evidence-based practices. Some of the differences, the mobile summer institutes that started back in 2004 have a focus on backward design, active learning. It's a 5-day intensive course that is basically like a project-based course. People come in, they engage in interactive workshops that basically use the same techniques to train them that they want them to use in their classrooms. And then there's a project-based component where they work in groups to create and present and get peer-reviewed teaching models using those same things. So we send them out back to their campuses, not only with new skills and conceptual understanding in that space, but also modules that they can use in their classrooms. Sensor also uses backward design and relies on those evidence-based practices, but it's very much around getting students very much engaged in STEM education and caring about learning it, because it's contextualized within sticky societal problems that make what they're learning relevant and important, and they see how they're contributing in that way. So we wanted to join forces between these two. That's the project goal here. We wanted to leverage their strengths. It's very much a yin-yang, where the Sensor program focuses on that relevance, that big societal problem, and having people be able to transform their courses around those is based on being able to include inclusive evidence-based teaching practices. For the Summer Institutes, their focus is the mechanistic side, the how do you get people to the point that they're able to implement successfully and long-term these evidence-based practices, and we use relevance hooks to help them build the modules around, and those two things, when they come together, are very complementary. And as I said before, the goal of focusing on the SUNY system is to take what we already know from the literature about what works in professional development and where there are gaps, to try to leverage the connectivity in the system to build that community and fill in some of those gaps for that, that deeper, longer term implementation. So this is what we achieved over the year. You can see up here we've got planned versus executed. And we had planned 7 professional development workshops around the state, sort of strategically placed at different institutions. We had 1 sensor workshop and 1 Mosey workshop for each of 3 locations, Geneseo, Binghamton, and Stony Brook, and some of the other schools that were around here. We're gonna share the responsibility for that, sorry. We also had already on the books was planned a Northeast Regional Summer Institute, and Stony Brook was already hosting that, so our grant was to fund people going to that. That occurred last July, so that still occurred, and you can see there were 14 people from Stony Brook, 2 from Farmingdale, 1 from Old Westbury, 3 from Suffolk County, and then there were 20 others that came from 20 different institutions in 12 states into that regional workshop. So that went off as it was supposed to. In addition, we had a sensor workshop in the fall at Binghamton University. And as you see, there were meant to be 2 of each of these in place. Because most of these were scheduled for the spring, the sensors, or for early summer, because the Mobile Summer Institute is an intensive 5-day workshop. Those occur in the summer. The pandemic hit and we had to cancel the in-person versions of all of those. So we weren't able to recover the sensor or Mosey that were going to happen in the eastern part of the state. And we weren't able to recover the Mosey that was going to occur at Geneseo, but we did develop online versions of the sensor workshop and the Mosey, the mobile SI workshop. And so we were able to, sorry, I keep hitting my touchpad. We were able to then recover the sensor for Geneseo. We had 12 participants there who went through the 2-day training to develop course modules around issues of societal relevance. And we had 9 Binghamton and 1 Geneseo faculty who came to the Binghamton Mosey that occurred this past summer in an online version. So that's what we were able to do, and the development of these 2 things, I think, is probably one of the most impactful things that we were able to do this summer, because having those 2 online versions is going to make both of these programs much more accessible and equitable, because it's going to increase access to this for institutions or faculty who didn't have the money to bring one of these programs to their campus, or the ability to travel to that. It also keeps them from, it allows them to be flexible in terms of having a more distributed model, because in the past, these were 1 to 2 day sessions or 5-day sessions in a sort of intensive mode, because it cost money to bring the training team to that campus to run that. But now that these are in online versions, they can be distributed for campuses. And so I think that's going to make it more accessible. So we were able to recover 4 of the 7 programs that we had planned. And we now have these 2 things as future projects. So the team that's working on this has plans this semester to work on an NSF grant and submit that for a SUNY-wide approach of the joint effort of these 2 programs. And we are also working on an idea for an online master's degree for STEM majors, sort of science for the public good, taking some of these same ideas and putting that into a master's program. So acknowledgements, I just want to thank Davita Smith from the New School and Drew Sieg from Truman, who were the sensor facilitators and developers of the online version, along with Eliza Riley. These folks, I won't go through all of them, are Mosey trainers and helped in developing the online Mosey and facilitating that. These are the programs that put money or support into the programs. We had funding from the SUNY ITG program, and we're able to leverage some of our current NSF and HHMI funding to help with that transition after many of the things were shut down due to COVID.
Thank you, Michelle. Sorry, sorry you had to go last, but
That's okay.
I'm willing to stick around if you are for a couple minutes. If anybody has
Sure.
questions, as we wait, I'll just say that I know that your project was one of the projects that was significantly impacted by COVID. I mean, everybody was in the shutdown, the pandemic, but it's really good to hear that you were able to kind of leverage that opportunity to create the online workshops. So we'll have to talk to figure out how to disseminate that and beyond in the future. So let's talk at some point. Any questions for Michelle about her project? So important, right? I mean, right now, I think more than ever, helping students, learn how science relates to the public good is,
Exactly.
it goes without saying, right? Any questions for Michelle? Still have a few people here. Questions?
Maybe I'll make one comment. So this is Peter Gergen from Sunnybrook. That one of the things about the Summer Institute, and this would go back to the problem of how do you get faculty engaged, is when that was created, it was created by biology faculty. So rather than having professionals in a Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching telling them how to teach better, it was tenure track, research active faculty that were saying, this is what I'm doing in my classroom and it works. And that was transformative for me when I went to an SI in 2011 to see research active, NIH funded faculty saying, you can do this in your classroom and it works.
Such a great point, Peter. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, but Michelle, this is your presentation. Do you want to speak to that at all, Michelle,
Well,
about how important
Peter's
that is?
part of my team, so I think he was just sort of chiming in there to give people an idea about this. But yeah, that was a big part of this, that was developed by people in the field, and some of the earlier resistance that we would get from faculty who were in that area saying, I don't want somebody who is from someplace else that doesn't know what my struggle is to tell me what to do. So it gave it a lot more leverage. And also early on, the National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine, we had a liaison with them. So in fact, we used their moniker to get things started as well. So the early days, these were called the National Academies Summer Institutes on Undergrad Biology Education.
Those of us who've worked in teaching and learning centers and have to work with faculty from a wide variety of backgrounds always emphasize that, something that works in the sciences will work in the humanities and social science, et cetera. However, you have to be realistic enough to know that it's not enough to just offer these sort of generic programs that are not tied to specific disciplines. For many faculty, they need, as Peter just mentioned, to hear from those who understand what they teach and have a similar faculty role. Maybe have the research pressers, working in labs, and all the other things that go around with that. They need to hear it from those folks like them before they're going to consider it. So great point. See something else in the chat here. Peter's comment, the same was true of Sensor, emerged from faculty work and expertise to teaching and learning experts later. We work with many now, right? Yeah, you got to hook them first, and then maybe the folks who are the actual experts, they'll be more receptive to what they have to say at a later point, right? Good point. Okay. All right, well, it is after 1. I want to thank all our presenters for, their excellent presentations today. I mean, again, this is near to me, so I really got a lot out of this. I'm going to go back and look at the recording and take it all in again. Once again, thank you, and everybody. We have 2 more of these. Oh, before I forget, let me put in the chat the link to the recording so everyone has that. So right now, we'll put the link to the recording on this page on the site that we're using for all the registration. So if you want to see the recording for this and the others, go there. Enjoy the rest of your day, your week, and be safe, be well, be sane. Take care, everybody.